1314. The fields outside Stirling Castle. An English army, 3 times the size of the Scots facing them, breaks and runs. Knights drown in the Bannockburn. Foot soldiers are cut down where they stand. It is, by any measure, one of the worst defeats in English military history, and it is also the moment that, decades later, would force a king to rebuild his entire army from the ground up. That king was Edward III. And by the time he was finished, England possessed something almost no other kingdom in Europe could match. An army that won battles it had no business winning, against enemies that outnumbered it 2, 3, sometimes 4 to 1. This is the story of how that army was built. The first thing Edward changed was who fought for him. His grandfather and father had relied on feudal summons. Lords called their tenants to arms because the law said they owed the king service, whether they wanted to fight or not, whether they were any good at it or not. Edward tore that system down and replaced it with something closer to a business arrangement. He signed contracts, indentures, with trusted captains. Each captain promised to deliver a set number of fighting men, fully equipped, for a fixed period, in exchange for wages. By the late 1350s, almost nobody in an English royal army was there because the law demanded it. They were there because they'd been paid to be. This sounds like a small bureaucratic shift. It wasn't. A feudal levy gave you whoever showed up, farmers, the unwilling, the unfit. A contract army gave you exactly who the captain chose to bring, and captains had every incentive to bring their best men, because the crown was paying for quality, not headcount. These soldiers usually came from the same villages, the same households, the same lord's estate. They'd trained together. Many had already fought together. That kind of familiarity doesn't show up in a muster roll, but it shows up on a battlefield. In the half-second it takes a unit to hold formation instead of scattering. It also meant England could now run several wars at once. Contracts let the king know, months in advance, almost exactly how many men he'd have, where, and for how long. Try doing that with feudal summons, where turnout depended on the mood of 200 different lords. With Aquitaine, Brittany, France, and Scotland all demanding attention during the 100 Years' War, that kind of predictability wasn't a luxury. It was the only way the war could be fought on so many fronts simultaneously. But none of this mattered without leadership, and this is where the previous generation of English kings had failed badly. Edward II was, by most accounts, simply not suited to command. Edward III was the opposite in almost every way, a king who studied his enemies, who planned campaigns with real patience, and who, by several contemporary accounts, liked nothing more than fighting shoulder to shoulder with ordinary men-at-arms, sometimes in plain armor so no one would treat him differently. That set the tone. But Edward also built something more durable than his own example, a generation of commanders. In 1348 he founded the Order of the Garter, pulling together not just the great noble houses but knights and minor lords who'd proven themselves in the field. Combine that with a recruitment system where successful captains kept getting bigger contracts, and you get a feedback loop. Talent rises, gets more responsibility, trains the next round of talent underneath it. By the later years of Edward's reign, England had something it had never really had before, a deep bench of officers who actually knew what they were doing. And what they taught their men was discipline, specifically the kind that runs against every instinct a medieval soldier had. Before Crecy, Edward reportedly warned his army that anyone who broke ranks to loot or chase glory before the battle was won would hang for it. Win the fight first, he told them, and there'd be time enough to plunder after. That single idea, hold the line, wait for the signal, became the difference between English armies and almost everyone else's. The French chronicler Jean Froissart noted, almost with surprise, that the English never seemed troubled by being outnumbered. That wasn't bravado. It was an army that had learned, the hard way, that formation discipline kept you alive far more reliably than a glorious charge did. Now, take that disciplined, professional, contract-recruited force, and put a longbow in half its hands. England had fielded foot archers for generations, but starting in the 1320s, Edward began mounting them. Not to fight from horseback, they still dismounted to shoot, but to move. And mobility changed everything. A foot archer covers maybe 12, 15 miles a day. A mounted one can range far further, reposition mid-campaign, react to a cavalry threat that would have outpaced him completely on foot. This is what made the Chivorci possible, those brutal, fast-moving raids deep into French territory designed to burn crops, wreck infrastructure, and humiliate an enemy who couldn't catch the raiders doing it. It also let archers fight offensively, not just defensively. In 1346, the Earl of Derby led 300 men-at-arms and 600 mounted archers to relieve the besieged town of Auberoche. They found a French camp of roughly 7,000 men eating dinner around their fires, completely unprepared. Archers took position near a tree line, men-at-arms swept in from two directions, and the camp was overrun before the French had a chance to organize. No infantry force could have reached that camp fast enough, or caught it that unaware. Speed was the entire weapon. By the 1330s, most English archers rode. By the 1380s, they outnumbered men-at-arms outright, and by the time of Agincourt in 1415, the ratio was something like 3 archers to every man-at-arms. Within a few more decades, it wasn't unusual to see 10 archers for every man-at-arms in the field. No other army in Europe carried that kind of ranged firepower per soldier, and the cost, mounted archers earned roughly double an infantry archer's wage, was simply absorbed as the price of an army that could move and strike faster than anyone expected. There's a social story buried in all of this too. Owning and keeping a horse wasn't cheap, so mounted archery quietly became a marker of modest prosperity rather than poverty. Edward formalized it directly in 1344, setting income thresholds for service. Land worth £2 a year got you serving as a foot archer, £5 and you rode, £10 made you a hobbler, 25 and up made you a man-at-arms. These weren't poor peasants forced into a war they had no stake in. They were the English yeomanry, men of real local standing, increasingly literate, increasingly skilled, and increasingly proud of what they did for a living. Some, like the archer John Hawkwood, parlayed that battlefield reputation into a knighthood and eventually a career as one of the most feared mercenary captains in Italy. That changing status mattered tactically, not just socially. In France, the gap between noble cavalry and common infantry stayed wide and the contempt mutual. In England, archers and men-at-arms increasingly came from similar social backgrounds, sometimes literally the same family, one brother riding as a man-at-arms while his younger brother served as a mounted archer. That closeness bred something the French never quite managed. Each side trusted the other to do its job, because each side understood exactly how much the other's job mattered to their own survival. Watch an English battle line from this period, and you can see that trust play out almost like a machine. Men-at-arms anchored the center, dismounted, shields and polearms ready to absorb the charge. Archers held the flanks, often behind stakes driven into the ground at an angle to gut any cavalry that tried to ride them down. As the enemy closed, arrows fell in waves, rarely enough on their own to stop a determined attack, but more than enough to break its momentum and its formation before it ever reached the English line. Then it was on the men-at-arms to hold, absorb the impact, and grind the assault to a halt. Once the enemy wavered, the same men-at-arms who'd just spent the fight on foot remounted and ran the retreat down. It's a system that needs both halves working in sequence, and it's exactly why, after the 1350s, when the French adapted with heavier plate armor and large pavis shields, the English didn't abandon the formula, they refined it. Eventually, this combination made nearly every other troop type obsolete. Crossbowmen got pushed into siege work and naval duty. Welsh spearmen, once essential for protecting archers, were replaced by stake lines and field fortifications that did the job without needing extra manpower. Light cavalry hobblers all but vanished. The mounted archer absorbed all of it, what one historian later called England's universal soldier, a single soldier type that could skirmish, scout, raid, besiege, defend, and fight pitched battles, depending entirely on what the campaign needed that week. That versatility showed up everywhere, not just on open battlefields. During the 1342 siege of Hennebont, a Breton garrison facing days of relentless bombardment sent archers out under cover of darkness to drive off the crew of the French siege engine wrecking their walls, holding the position just long enough for other troops to destroy it outright. At sea, archers stationed in the raised fore and aft castles of English ships could pin an enemy crew below deck long enough for boarding parties to do their work. Naval combat, at this point, still came down to grappling and close fighting, and longbows simply made the approach to that fight far more lethal for whoever was on the receiving end. None of these individual pieces, the contracts, the leadership, the mounted archers, the social shift, the tactics, would have been enough on its own. What made Edward III's reforms a genuine turning point in European warfare was how completely they reinforced each other. Better recruitment produced better soldiers. Better soldiers, led by officers who'd actually proven themselves, could be trusted with real tactical discipline. That discipline let archers and men-at-arms operate as one integrated system instead of two separate forces that happened to share a battlefield. And that system is what won Crecy in 1346, won Poitiers a decade later, and gave England a level of battlefield dominance that would shape the next century of European warfare. It started with a humiliating defeat at Bannockburn. It ended with English armies that the rest of Europe genuinely feared to meet in open battle. If you want more deep dives like this one into the wars, weapons, and commanders that shaped medieval Europe, that's exactly what we do here at Crimson Archive. So hit subscribe, drop a like if you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next video.